tradition. Good evening. My name is Nancy Dallins. I am Director of Education. That's a friend of a friend back there. Here at the Tampa Bay History Center, welcome to the first Florida Conversations lecture of 2024. We are so glad that you are here. We are in TECO Hall at the History Center. Today is Wednesday, January 10th. We are live, but we're recording it for future viewing on our website or YouTube channel. Welcome to all our in-person and virtual guests. So we have a great program this evening. As you know, we love and celebrate local Tampa history, and this month marks our 15th anniversary of the museum in this building. Thank you all who helped us get here. Many of you are here, and you know who you are. Tonight's program is made possible by the Tampa Bay History Center Endowment Fund at USF, USF Libraries, AARP Florida, and WUSF Public Media. A huge thanks to these generous sponsors. Before we get started, I'll make a few announcements and then hand it over to Dr. Kevin Kokomoor, our guest speaker tonight. The History Center here in downtown Tampa offers 12,000 years of Florida history through beautiful galleries as well as interesting and fun programs. We have lectures, walking tours, adult learning courses, summer camps, field trips, and guided tours. Please check our website for full details. At the moment, we have 2 temporary exhibits, both on display until the mid-year: Decade of Change, Florida in the 1920s, and Sharps and Marks in Paradise, Selling Florida in the 1920s. Our next Florida conversation will be Wednesday, February 28th, featuring a TBHC member and historian, Dr. David Barkley. He will speak on How Do We Deal with Our Confederate Ancestors, the story of John B. Jackson. Some of you have some postcards in your seats that shows the full lineup of all 5 programs this spring. So 2 housekeeping notes. The museum store will be open through the conclusion of the program. We are selling Dr. Kokomoor's book, and he will be available to sign it afterwards. And we'll take questions at the conclusion, of course in person, but our virtual guests can put them in the Q&A section, and we'll get to those. So now for tonight's program, Dr. Kevin Kokomoor. He's a 4th-generation Floridian, grew up in the Tampa Bay area. He got his bachelor's and master's at USF and his doctorate in early American history at FSU. He now works at Coastal Carolina University in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. So help me welcome Dr. Kokomoor, who will discuss his book, La Florita, Catholics, Conquistadors, and Other American Origin Stories.
First off, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I look forward to any questions you guys have. We'll try to make as much time as we can afterwards. So I'll jump right in. My talk is in support of a book on early Spanish history and what is more than just Florida, but most of the early Southeast. Because La Florita, for a long time, is just about everything south of Virginia, everything east of the Mississippi. It is Spain's claim to North America. And so when we mean La Florita, we certainly do mean the peninsula of Florida, but we mean so much more. And the book it's structured around ideas. It's structured around connections. Connections between Florida and Spanish colonialism elsewhere. Connections between Florida and South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. It is structured around origins, the reasons why people would come and attempt to colonize Florida. The Catholic Church plays an incredible role in this. Transformations, the way that Spaniards in the larger Southeast more or less destroyed the native Southeast or transformed it. And disease, epidemic disease is the best example of that. But in transforming it, even though, there is incredible and almost we don't even really fully understand, and we probably will never fully understand the degree of that destruction, Florida Seminoles exist because of it. And then we have legacies. And, some of the stuff that actually has origins during this era that you wouldn't necessarily think of. Stuff like, I argue barbecue has its origins in the early Spanish Southeast. Oranges, cattle, actually, right? Some of these things that if you evoke Florida history, they're not what they used to be 100 years ago, but they still, some of the earliest traditions. So the point is, some of the earliest traditions, some of the longest lasting legacies actually evoke a Spanish tradition. And, I do want to say, with the caveat there is that I make sure to make it clear in the book, and I'll make it clear now, that in no way is this, synonymous with this is a good thing. This can be extremely problematic, extremely violent, extremely closed-minded. So, I just want to make that clear, that this is not like a triumphalism history of colonialism. But I like to try to weave all of these ideas in through a region. And so you can see all of these separate sort of ideas play out in an area. And the area that I give you guys is the Gulf of Mexico and the western Gulf of Mexico. Let me see if this area right here. And I get this from John Worth, who teaches the University of West Florida. He is a genius with making maps of the Southeast. So I'd like to give, obviously, him credit where I'm using his maps. But, what you see are all of these colored lines all over the Southeast, and a lot of them actually have to do with the Gulf of Mexico. And so we'll talk about the Gulf of Mexico and the western Gulf of Mexico. And Tampa as much as we can, the Tampa Bay area as much as we can, the Tampa Bay area down to about Charlotte Harbor, the larger Tampa Bay area. And the important role that this plays, the key critical role that this plays in sort of the colonial Southeast, the colonial Spanish Southeast. So I will go just a little bit back, just for a little bit. And we will say, right, that the seafaring tradition that you understand with ocean going months at a time, scurvy, all the terrible stuff with long distance travel, it does not come out of the same place, of all places at the same time. These ships, Portuguese naus, Spanish carracks, caravels, galleons, they are invented. This is technology that is invented to travel extreme distances and come back. They are cargo ships, but they are meant for traveling months at a time in heavy seas. And what you can see, the technology at the time, you'll have maybe like a lateen rig right there, which is good for moving in and out very close to the wind. But then you have larger square rigs right here, and that's really meant for squeezing every ounce of prevailing winds to get a ship going in open seas. They're very deep, they're very wide. They're very small by 20th century standards. They are tiny. It would just blow your mind to see a ship that Columbus sailed the ocean blue in. You would never do that. But they are big at the time. And when we look at this period in world history, we understand this period as the age of exploration. And that's when basically the world begins changing, the world marketplace opens up. And there are winners and there are losers to connecting massive populations to exotic goods. And we know this now as the Silk Road. It could be called the Opium Road. It could be called the Spice Road, right? It could be called basically world trade. And who are the winners, right? The Genoans, the Venetians, they emerge as the winners, and this is why it's the Italian Renaissance, because they make all the money from this world trade. Well, who is at the dead end? It would be the combined kingdoms of Spain and Portugal. That's why they make these ships, right? They can't compete, right, with those that control the Mediterranean from the east. They can't compete with the Venetians and the Genoans. It's a boot that hangs out right in the middle of the Mediterranean. You can't get around them. So what do they decide to do, right? They go around, and they do go around, right? Which is why the Portuguese Empire is one of the first sort of world empires. But obviously we know what happens here is that Columbus heads that way. And here's where we start to get a little closer to home. We get closer to home because when you are traveling in these cycles, what you uncover is a current system, a trade wind system that no one knows exists, right? And when you begin pushing further and further out, and I hit the wrong button, further and further out off the coast of, Cadiz or Lisbon, when you push further and further out, you find the Madeiras, you find the Cape Verdes, which are incredibly important. And what you do is you unlock a world current system that you don't understand, right? It will take you to the Caribbean, whether you are alive or dead on that boat, right? It will hit the Caribbean somewhere. It has to, right, unless you get caught up in a storm. And we understand the theme of storm, and I'll get back to this again a little bit later, but we certainly understand the theme of a storm through the Gulf. Obviously, everyone was around yesterday. But, right, what we have is everyone knows this system right here. Everyone understands that in the 21st century because that is the hurricane system. Right? They ride the same prevailing winds and the same current and the same water. Right? So these are the currents that take Columbus. It's not perfect. Right? We know that he enters the Caribbean at different times. He exits the Caribbean in different places. So this is not a perfect science. Prevailing winds, also circulate, so it's not just currents. But what you are figuring out are these basically regional and even world current systems that will take you where you need to go. And that, I explain it, to students. I explain it in the book. Whoever figure this out, it's inevitable, right? I mean, the currents will take you there. So when we zoom in and when we get a little closer and closer to the Gulf, what we see is the currents don't just stop at the Caribbean. What you have here, CC would be the Caribbean current, the Yucatan current, the Mexican current, the Loop current, the Florida current, and the Gulf Stream. Does everybody see a highway there? It enters the Caribbean and it exits the Caribbean. In fact, in the book, I like to refer to this stretch as the original I-95 that moves up the East Coast from Miami all the way up to the Outer Banks where it finally shoots off. That's how you get home. That's how you get there, and that's how you get home. And to simplify it, it is a very straightforward set of currents. And when you know how to manipulate them, you can cruise the top like this through the Bahamian Islands, or you can hopscotch ports here, move through the Yucatan current. You could shoot a left here and go to Veracruz, or you could ride the Loop current to the Florida current, and that's how you get out. Until we put engines in boats, that's it. There's really no other way. You can go, a little bit up the coast, a little bit down the coast, but if you are traveling in these huge galleons that are loaded with treasure, you don't turn on a dime. You roll, you move with the currents, right? And that image is the same thing as that image. That is the image of the Spanish treasure fleets. And so every one of these you can imagine is a bank vault representing the exploitation of the New World. Silver from Peru is shipped to Cartagena on the backs of natives and llamas, and it is stored in a massive bank vault in Cartagena until a ship comes by and loads down. Same thing happens in Maracaibo. Same thing happens in Portobello. That's a big one right there because of obviously the gold and silver in central Mexico. Once or twice a year, they bebop through the Caribbean. It takes months. It's very slow. They all agree to meet in Havana, where they take on armed transports because there's pirates all over the place, because everyone knows that these are the routes. And then everyone moves out through the Florida Straits and enters the Gulf Stream. And then you're out back to the Canaries and then back to Spain. And so what we have here is this really unique, just cutting into the seafloor of all of this water. All of the water that enters in the Caribbean has to leave through a very narrow channel, which is why when you look at topographic images off the Keys, right, you're leaving out of Miami or you're leaving out of Isla Morada and you go up to, the reef and it goes from like 20 feet to 6 feet, and then it goes 6 feet, 20 feet, 100 feet, 500 feet, and you're like, oh man, right? It just make you realize how small you are when you watch it drop like that. And then within, 90 miles here or 30 miles here, you're on rocks again. Right? And so all of the water, this is like a fire hose. The Spanish figured this out, which is why, again, do you not see I-95 there? All right, that is the way that you get up the East Coast. This is as important for me in South Carolina. Obviously, it's closest in Florida, but it goes all the way up to the Outer Banks. You can choose to leave it earlier, but if you choose to leave it earlier, you're going to run into Bermuda or the Bahamas, right? So it's fairly standard. And what happens here is that people die here all the time. I'm slowly but surely going to make this make sense. I'm weaving it closer and closer. Here, what we have here, the head of the martyrs. The early keys are named the martyrs, and we don't really have to guess as to why that is, right? It goes all the way back to the 1530s, where they say, you know, there are rocks, and maybe it looks like people are, you know, it's just a terrible place. Because if you are cruising this, you have 90 miles here and 30 miles there, which means one bad gust of wind and you're on the rocks, right? And early seafaring, a lot of sailors go by sight. They want to sight the coast. And obviously, if you're sighting the coast, that's extremely problematic. If the coast is a mile away and it goes from 100 feet to 10 feet, just like that, that's problematic, right? But you have to do that. So we have these places right here, another early map, and I want you guys to focus on this section right here. The martyrs. Right? I mean, these places have horrendous legacies for shipwrecks, for obvious reasons. I will say, as a side, just some useless Florida trivia. These guys right here, they get a different name. Does anybody know why? Right? The Tortugas. Right? This comes from Hernando de Escalante Fontanada. And formed of sand, at some time they have been the foundations of caves and must have been eaten away by the currents of the sea, which have left them bare, plain sand. They are 7 leagues in circumference and are called the islands of the Tortugas, for turtle are there. Right? So, you know, this gets into the idea of Spaniards name all this stuff. And in a lot of times, they name stuff for extreme and awesome natural phenomena, like Tortugas. In fact, they stopped there for water, and they're like, we did not find any fresh water, but you know what we did find? Tons of sea turtles. And they by the way, they ate them all, which is crazy. I mean, you would go to prison for the rest of your life for doing anything near that, what they pulled off in the Tortugas. But, right, this section right here, this is one of the scariest sections of coastline in the world. And we know, for example, before we focus even further in on Tampa, is that it's a partial list of shipwrecks that we know about. Yeah, not all of these are 16th and 17th century, but you get the point, right? I mean, they are still dangerous in the 21st century. So you can imagine, right? You are cruising through the coast, and something bad happens. Your ship is lost. You are lost. These ships are not just lost. They are lost carrying the combined wealth of New Spain, gold and silver, right? So we have the Ais and the Jaga. These are east coast of Florida. Are poor Indians as respects to the land, for there are no mines of silver or gold where they are, and in short, they are rich only by the sea from the many vessels that have been lost. So Hernan de Escalante Fontanada basically says, we find like natives walking around wearing gold and silver. There are no gold and silver mines there. They are literally picking it up off the beach. The Ais, which is a little bit north of a little bit north of Miami, which perhaps wears $1 million or over in bars of silver and gold and in articles of jewelry made by the hands of Mexican Indians and literally minted in Mexico, right? What the passengers are bringing with them. So we know that ships go down all the time. If you are cruising this area right here, you have absolutely no idea that a hurricane is coming until the barometer drops, and by that point it's too late. You're in the Keys. There's no safe portage in the Keys. You will get destroyed, utterly destroyed. The obvious example of this, before we switch a little bit more Tampa bound, is 1715. Right there. X marks the spot. That is where 12 ships go down in a hurricane. Kills 1,000 people. Because they leave too late in the season. And when they leave too late in the season, there is nothing stopping you from all of the force of an Atlantic hurricane. And in that case, they lose 12 ships laden with gold and silver. And, you know, we have these images of, you know, the galleons and flota usually joining at the Havana, and the whole armada sails for Spain. except then they got hit by a hurricane. So we know this is a real problem, right? And we know that these shipwrecks, I mean, they literally are in the shore. There's some legalese here because of United States Salvage Code. If it's in the water, you can't touch it, but if it's on the sand, it's yours, finders, keepers. So after like a really big cold front, I mean, they only recovered like 50% of what was on those ships. It's still out there. And after every cold front, beach detectorists go out and they can find a silver piece. I want to do that, but, right? So we have, this is the reason why Spaniards settle here. This is a real problem. You have an example of they're here to destroy pirates. They're here because they're Catholics, so they don't want the French Protestants here. But another reason is they have got to secure these treasure fleets because bad things happen, right? And it could happen anywhere along that. And even if St. Augustine is right there, right, we have enough evidence that bad things happen so often it is worth it for the Spanish to invest in Florida, even though by this point, Florida makes no money. It is a terrible colony. It is supported by the crown because it is a strategic outpost. And we know that this also exists here. It's not just right, this stretch that we refer to now as the Gulf Stream. This is why the loop current is the loop current. Does everybody see that? Water enters in. It's like a big washing machine here. You can head down through the Mexican current to Veracruz here, but you have to take the loop current all the way down and then shoot out. And by the way, one of the most famous shipwrecks that we will ever have is in the loop current. Because what do we know about hurricanes? We get our fair share. We know that, that come up through the Gulf. And what do we also know? The storm that happened yesterday, that would have produced that would have been a really big deal a couple hundred years ago, right? You are looking, you experience something. I was actually driving through here in St. Pete, and you're looking at gusts of wind, you're looking at rain and hail. That is the kind of stuff that would cause it's not just hurricane season. Cold fronts, hurricanes, right? A cold front that has amassed over the entire Gulf of Mexico, by the time it hits you here, it's a hurricane as far as you're concerned, right? And so we have our Gulf wrecks. And one of these little guys down here is the really big one. That is the Senora de Atocha. Nuestra Senora de Atocha, right there off the Marquesas. That holds the world record. That made Mel Fisher. By the way, there's Mel Fisher. Chains from the Atocha. You know, the crazy thing about gold is it doesn't really rust. Came out of the water like that. No one wears those chains. Those chains are minted to be reminted, to travel, right? So you're talking about gigantic silver and gold blocks, right? Actually, I went to a bachelor party in Key West, and we were cruising, just sort of like a gentleman's booze cruise up through the canals. And you know what I found? That is my picture. I nerded out so hard when I saw that, because that is his ship, right? And he has his treasure museum in Key West, that was pulled out of the Gulf of Mexico in 60 feet of water. I mean, these guys basically invented the techniques, like the magnetometers that sense the Earth's magnetic field and all that good stuff, right? He basically invented it. In fact, you know, this right here behind you, nope, I'm going the wrong way, I apologize. That piece right behind him, basically you can turn that into the water, and the power of the engines basically just washes sand off the seafloor. So if we bring this closer to home and we say, this is why so many Spaniards try for Florida and why they won't give up when everyone dies, right? Because these are all attempts to settle this place. And if you look at names in Florida and names in the larger Southeast, here's where we get to more of these connections. The original Tampa Bay, Espiritu Santo. There is another Espiritu Santo. Then there is Andre, Rosa, Jordan, Santa Maria, let's see, St. Martin, on here St. Augustine, St. Philip, let's see, St. Catherine. Why are all these saints? Why are all these feast names? Because Spaniards when they discover, quote unquote, they name it either A, after something incredible, like turtles, and there's nothing incredible, then they name it after saints from the Catholic calendar of saints and feast days. And I use this one because this is a random one, I think, from June, but I use this one because it's, external solemnity of Corpus Christi. Does anybody want to take a guess at when Corpus Christi was named? On that day. Right? So, why do you have the same names over and over again? Because Spaniards were nowhere near this place from August to January. If that makes sense. That's hurricane season. So you have the same names over and over again because you only have so many days. And it's not like there's things that are named 17 times over, but there's at least 4 Espiritu Santos because that's in June. That's not hurricane season. Hurricane season is not till August, right? You have it could be hotter than hell there, but there's no huge storms there, right? So Pascua, Florida. That's a feast. That's a feast in late March and early April. That's when these places, even that's kind of tricky, right? Because that's cold front season. So all of these rivers that you see, including Tampa Bay, right, originally have saint names because there is the Spanish connection. All the way up the East Coast. That's 1533. It's all been named. Right? All of these names have disappeared. Earl of Hillsborough takes over Hillsborough Bay and they rename it and everything. But, that was in the Bay of San Carlos, Calusa, right, because of naming someone. But, right, if we continue with these, and then we look at attempts to settle, there's where you pick up gold. There's where you die, trying to get it home. The first attempts to settle Florida, Pensacola and Santa Elena. Pensacola is failed in 1559. Tristan de Luna and Arellano settles it in 1559, and he does it in September. And does anybody want to tell me what his fatal flaw was? Within a week of landing, he gets waxed by a major hurricane. I mean, how many times in the past 10 years have hurricanes hit the panhandle? That's not that strange. That's about the right time, too. Right? Other vessels have been lost. This is Fontanada again. He's a shipwreck victim in Tampa. I haven't said that yet. I thought that's kind of important for me to say. All of these primary sources come from a castaway. He survives. His brother and the rest of his family are killed by natives. And he lives for 15 years in this territory until he is discovered by none other than Pedro Menendez de Aveles. Pedro Menendez de Aveles lands in St. Augustine and immediately goes down to the west coast around Tampa and Charlotte Harbor. And this guy comes running, all tan, looks like a native, and he starts screaming in Spanish, "Don't kill me, I'm actually Spanish." That's Hernando Escalante Fontanada. And you know what he tells Pedro Menendez de Aveles? Your son is dead because your son shipwrecked here. That's another reason why St. Augustine even exists. Pedro Menendez de Aveles had orders from the king to wipe out the French, orders to the king to do this and do that. But you know why he also came here? Because years ago, he lost his son in a shipwreck on the west coast of Florida and never knew what happened to him. And we don't know the veracity of this. This comes from Fontanada's recording, but he says he knew Pedro Menendez's son, and he knew him to have been killed. So, in all of the reasons why you have the establishment of Florida, that connection, he's a shipwreck victim. He's the first to successfully found Florida. They reconnect literally right here. And this is where, he gives him the bad news. And Menendez takes this to heart. This is all of the evidence that he needs that Florida must exist. And when he sets up these original outposts, and again, this is a John Worth map. When he sets up these original outposts, the red are the later ones. Ignore the red. We're looking at the blue ones. Notice the blue one in Tampa Bay, Tocobaga, Calusa, Tequesta, and Ais. Why does he put those there? Those are for shipwrecks. He wants to cover every possible aspect of the Florida Strait. As soon as he comes into Florida, we look at this map, and you get the understanding of how little people actually understood about the interior of Florida. Everyone thinks it is one vast swamp. That's in the 1760s. People have been around for 200 years, and they still have no idea what's in the interior of Florida. Menendez de Aviles is convinced that he can create, that those connect. So he goes down the St. Johns River all the way to Lake George, and he goes up the Caloosahatchee all the way to the Okeechobee, trying to find a connection from one coast to the other. Because he says, if I die trying, I will connect the Gulf of Mexico to the Atlantic Ocean, so no one will ever have to go around the Strait of Florida ever again. We know this now as this is the original cross-Florida barge canal. It essentially tries to do the same thing. It cuts off the strait, because it's a death trap. And Menendez knows this firsthand. And even he sends Juan Pardo from Santa Elena all the way up. He says, I want you to find a road to Zacatecas in Mexico from South Carolina. By the way, I don't necessarily need to do this, but does everybody see where central Mexico is? Does everybody see where South Carolina is? You know, no one understands how big the interior of the continent is. And so Juan Pardo basically keeps going and going and going, and he finally hits Tennessee and says, I don't know where I am, but I am not in Mexico. And he has to turn around. No one has any idea where he is. He ends up building forts in East Tennessee. It's actually kind of incredible that Spaniards are up in East Tennessee. The point is, the whole point of that is build a road to Mexico so that no one ever has to die in the Florida Straits ever again. All of these fail, and what you are left with is St. Augustine. But they do finally get Pensacola, and they do finally get St. Augustine. And they never really developed that connection. But that's why, because this stretch right here, from about right here, all the way through here to right here, it kills so many people. And it loses so much money. Right, that people are always trying to figure that out. You see the connection. One or two more things that come from Hernando Escalante de Fontaneda. It's hidden in here. His memoirs are not outrageously long. He was there for about 10 or 15 years. His memoirs are, he says, Juan Ponce de Leon, giving heed to the tale of the Indians of Cuba and Santo Domingo, went to Florida in search for the River Jordan. By the way, that's biblical as well, obviously. And there are at least a half a dozen rivers that are named the River Jordan, including the St. John's, before it was named St. John's. What is he referring to? One of our first references to the fountain of youth comes from Hernando Escalante de Fontaneda. He says, right, if he doesn't get rich and famous, then that he might become young from bathing in such a stream. By the way, he does not invent it. Peter Martyr says it first. We have no idea where it comes from because Juan Ponce de Leon never says anything about this. But, right, he says it, and you know what he says? This thought was of itself proof that all must have been fiction that was told by the Indians of Cuba and its whole neighborhood, blah, 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 because he says, to which at least I can say that while I was captive there, I bathed in many streams, but to my misfortune, I never came upon that river. A little tongue-in-cheek. He's being sarcastic. He's like, I was captive there for 20 years, and I don't know anything about a fountain of youth. He's one of the first ones that says that this is a myth. He is a shipwrecked victim, right, who lives in this region. And, you know, if you think of the largest, like, consequences of him, you know, would Pedro Menendez de Aviles have even stayed in Florida if he didn't run across that guy? Who knows? Maybe, maybe not. So we have him, and I will end with one before him. And this one you probably haven't heard. Everyone's heard the Fountain of Youth. We're all Floridians here. We're raised with that one. How about this one? Pánfilo de Narvaez. By the way, if you go down to Jackson's Bistro or American Social, where the marina is there is a plaque to Pánfilo de Narvaez. So next time you're there, look for that. It's right there. He lands here in 1528, and who is immediately snatched up? A guy by the name of Juan Ortiz. And everyone else dies, by the way. Pánfilo Narvaez dies floating out to sea somewhere around here. It's a complete and utter disaster. There's like 400 people in his expedition, and like literally 3 people 8 years later walk into Mexico City. But Juan Ortiz is left behind. He's not exactly a shipwreck castaway, but he's a castaway. And you know who runs across him later? Hernando de Soto. Hernando de Soto runs across him, and Juan Ortiz serves as Hernando de Soto's interpreter. Would Hernando de Soto have gotten anywhere if he didn't have a guy that spoke every language in Florida? And here's the story of him. He is Calusa, capture him. And the headman, Yusita, wants to kill this guy so bad. He tries on 3 different occasions. He straps him to a barbacoa and tries roasting him alive. He says he's got sores on him the size of oranges. You know who comes to save him 3 separate times? Now, we don't know this from the actual primary sources. They never say her name. Eulalie, the chief's daughter, 3 times. Juan Ortiz survives. And we know a lot about this. 3 times she throws herself in front of him. In fact, in the end, because Yusita just really wants to kill this guy so bad, no matter what his daughters do, that his daughter literally steals him in the middle of the night and walks him up to Tocobaga, where the headman Makosa takes him under his wing because he hates Yusita. And that's how Juan Ortiz survives, because of this girl. Is that ringing a bell to anybody? Do you know who plagiarized this account? By the way, we don't know this for sure, but we're pretty sure that, Pocahontas. John Smith never said anything about Pocahontas until like 15 years after this whole thing. He never said anything about that. As historians, we say, he was never in threat. The headman Powhatan really wanted to, basically make him a member of the family. So it was like an initiation rite where you give you a new identity. And you just had absolutely no idea what was going on, so you thought you were probably going to die. That's one explanation, if it really did happen. And you know what the other explanation is? It never happened. That guy read an account of Garcilaso de la Vega, Chronicles of Hernando de Soto, and he plagiarized it, because he had done that several times already. So we have all of these really incredible, so these are legends, right? We have these legends that have their origins more or less in castaways, right? In this area, and again, I hope I've done a decent job of at least narrowing the net, if not exactly to Tampa Bay, because Ortiz was picked up in Tampa from Macoso. But just the general sort of West Gulf of Mexico and all of the ways that it weaves in and through and in all of these stories. If we just totally give up on the whole Pocahontas thing, would Hernando de Soto have gone through the Southeast if Juan Ortiz was not there and spoke tons of different languages? He was with Hernando de Soto all the way till he got to Texas. He was there the whole time. He was the go-between. So I offer all of these, there he is, there's De Soto. He picks up Ortiz, and you're off. So I give these examples. We have, the other legend that comes out of this is the Black Legend of Spanish Conquest, which is a legend about how barbaric and violent and world-ending Spaniards were anywhere they went. And the Spanish friar that writes it, Bartolomé de las Casas, he has a chapter in his book for Floridians. He says, Hernando de Soto is one of the few who totally got what was coming to him, because they all died here. This is where conquistador dreams died. Right? In fact, Juan Pardo is the only one who didn't die. Right? Tristan de Luna and Ariano didn't die, but he died in disgrace. So I mean, it was bad. But so in summation, I know that we're basically right about there, right at exactly 45 minutes, and so I could obviously spin more yarns, but the idea is that there is this, all of these legacies, and I use the example of Juan Ortiz. Juan Ortiz is a legacy. I mean, there is a, historians, that is an argument. We'll never know exactly if it was the case, but everything that John Smith says happens to him actually happened to Juan Ortiz. And we know that everything that comes out of the Juan Ponce de Leon Fountain of Youth myth came out of the mouth of other people, one of which, one of the original guys, was cast away right here. And even the connections, right? Would Florida have been settled if it wasn't for Spanish treasure fleets? Right? St. Augustine was a horrible place to be. It never made any money, and Spain would never let it go because, they had to save lives and they had to save ships. So, I offer all of these connections, origins, transformations. It's easy to see all of this stuff in one place. And I think, the Gulf has gotten a lot of attention. A Slaughter has a maritime history of the Gulf. Obviously, Jack Davis wrote his book. People are really coming to understand the true power and importance of the Gulf. And, this book, I essentially, try to build on that. There's all these really incredible stories about the Spanish legacy in the Southeast that really begin with the Gulf of Mexico. So it's not the whole book, but it plays a really important part of the book, and it's there in all sorts of places. So with that, I will wrap up, and I would love to hear feedback or some questions from anybody, if any, and so I really appreciate you sitting here and listening to me. I will open the floor to questions. Yes? Are we?
Please repeat the question.
So the question is, did people pick up on this? And yes, they did, but it's very imprecise, unfortunately. Depending on the, hurricane season is it's only 4 months. Cold front season is only a couple months, but the trip from, say, from the Cape Verde Islands could be 3 weeks to 2 months crossing the Atlantic. Another 2 months moving through the Gulf, the Caribbean and the Gulf. By that time, the ship is got worms all over it. It's weighed down with gold and silver. It's moving slowly. The timing has to be perfect, and so they do know, absolutely. But a lot of these things are out of their control, and so they try to get in and out as best as they can. But we do know the real irony of Menendez is that he tells one of his sons, I don't remember if it's the exact same son, he tells his son, who then becomes the admiral of the treasure fleets, don't leave any later than July. If it becomes July and you are still here, you wait it out until February. And so they do know, but at the same time, just pushing out, that trip is not necessarily, it's relatively standard, but a lot of variables there that could take months. Yes. I think she can give you a map. A microphone.
Thank you. I don't know the details, but I appreciate that Florida was not profitable for Spain, and that a huge Spanish population never successfully colonized a lot of Florida. But I guess my question is, from the point of view of the Spanish primary sources, how did people back in Spain and how did the Spanish court assess the success or failure of the Floridian colony? Were they content with the strategic value of St. Augustine? Did they think they were successful with what they were trying to do?
So over several times they attempt to abandon it. We know that that soldiers that exist in the garrison there, the Castillo de San Marcos, they are paid through royal funds shipped through Mexico. And the Viceroy of New Mexico, basically, they exist in a singularly unique relationship to the crown. No other colony exists like that. And again, that is because we don't want to put, we want to gloss over. That's because the Spaniards could not find a dense enough native population to exploit. Because any money that was made through the repartimiento, the encomienda, haciendas. They tried. They really did try. But these native populations weren't dense enough. The land was too spread out enough. They could not make the encomienda work. But Florida was St. Augustine, then Pensacola. It serves no other function than a strategic value. And to the crown, they bemoan it for hundreds of years. A very important moment comes when Robert Cyril, I believe, raids St. Augustine in the 1680s, burns the whole town to the ground, and Spain comes back and says, we're either going to abandon this place or we're going to invest in it. And that's when they begin building the Castillo de San Marcos out of coquina. And so they do have like a gut check moment of whatever this is supposed to be doing, it's not doing it. But time and time again, there are always voices that call for Florida to be abandoned because it is a money pit. But the crown and the viceroy of New Spain sees it as so strategically important. It's not just the treasure fleets. That is their establishment of ownership. If they're not there, they have no firm claim to it, if that makes sense. So they feel compelled, and they make efforts to squeeze money out of it. It never works. People, I mean, I don't want to say like it disappears. People do live there, but it doesn't grow, and it is always at the mercy of crown subsidies. They hate it, but they're forced to basically subsidize St. Augustine. Yes?
Yeah, a question from online. Do you think the whole foundational myth of America beginning in New England, specifically by the Pilgrims, should be changed to include the Spanish, or should the Spanish be viewed more as transient traders and explorers, kind of like the French in the Northeast?
Yeah, so that is the core argument here, is that almost every single sort of foundational origin story that you think of as quintessentially American, there is more than one of those. 1619, for the beginning of slavery in Virginia. Slavery existed in Florida for 100 years already. 1621, Pilgrims in Plymouth. Pedro Menendez writes down, we fed the Indians. This is, I think it's, at University of South Florida, St. Pete now, it was, Michael J. Francis. We keep making this argument every year and just no one listens to it. And it's because it just so fundamentally does not fit what I would call, yes, a mythology. That it's not that there aren't New England harvest festivals. It's not that there isn't a beginning of slavery in Virginia. But that isn't like the one narrative. It's actually more complicated. There are several origin stories. And the question of why, well, that's because, it does complicate this idea of Pilgrims at Plymouth, Protestant, everything is great, orderly expansion of the frontier. We have a very neat American identity. And that is something that, honestly, adding the Spanish to that would obviously complicate that. It doesn't overturn it, but it complicates it. And I think that is exactly what needs to be done. And I hope people get that idea from reading this book, honestly. I mean, that's the whole idea here. Yes. And I think she's going to hand you a microphone.
Yes. In the Cabeza de Vaca narrative, the survivors you referred to that ended up in Mexico after basically walking across the continent, he was on the Narvaez expedition that landed in 1528, and they landed probably on the west side of St. Petersburg around Boca Ciega Bay, and they marched overland from after breakfast to vespers, and this would have been in April, so you can calculate how long. They ended up somewhere on the shore of old Tampa Bay around Safety Harbor, and they found some Indian houses, they said, that had boxes that had contained, crates that had contained merchandise from Castile. And they were left there, and McDougall, a man named Jim McDougall, wrote 2 books about the Narvaez party. And in the second one, he had come across a map that was enlarged had a section of it enlarged in a book by a scholar at Yale who is the definitive study on the whole cabeza de vaca thing, and he found that is labeled as the Bay of Juan Ponce, and therefore he in his second book he says that's where Ponce de Leon went, and that's where he had some kind of a skirmish and had to leave, and they had to leave in haste and hence left the boxes. When De Soto came, when different people came and said, where do you get these things from Castile? And they said, oh, it was a shipwreck. And his idea is, well, there aren't many shipwrecks, there's groundings and so on. But he thinks that Ponce de Leon was up here on the shores of Tampa Bay and had to leave in haste, and hence that account, and hence the map, the topographic indication already before 1528 as the Bay of Juan Ponce up there. And I was just wondering what you thought of that idea, or had you run across this yourself?
Yeah, I mean, so we're referring to, I think, the second attempt, well, the first attempt. Juan Ponce de Leon had gotten a capitulacion from the king, and he was supposed to settle, and he is immediately repulsed on the coast, and it ends up costing him his life. And everyone, he had brought, hundreds, maybe more than 1,000 settlers or prospective settlers. We have something similar that exists off the coast of South Carolina, where Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón tries to settle basically what is now somewhere between Brunswick, Georgia, and Winyah Bay. And we have natives that when Hernando de Soto moves through, they have Spanish goods in their hand that they clearly got from the remains of San Miguel de Guadalupe, which is where the Spaniards try to set up on the coast of South Carolina. So that's another example that I think would suggest that that's a strong argument that there are several different instances where you run across the remains of settlements. Again, in Ayut by Tallahassee, where Narvaez basically builds these ships and basically has to eat the horses. Well, they found the skulls of the horses, and they found the remnants of basically a shipbuilding facility. So, we have most of the gold and silver that Fontaneda talks about actually is on the East Coast. He doesn't talk a whole lot about the Calusa having it, except for they actually go to war with Ais and the Tequesta, and they grab it and take it back. But that is actually a really important thread, is that Spaniards see this stuff. They don't know how it got there, and they assume that natives mint this stuff, or that there's a source of wealth here. And that is just, if natives, they had no Western, I guess you could say, idea of gold having monetary value. If they knew that wearing gold would evoke the kind of responses from the Spaniards, they definitely would not have done that. But I know that, that is, they would have thrown that right back in the water. But, I am fascinated by the Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca story. That is, I don't remember where I read it, but just absolute, just travel lore gold. I mean, it is just pain and suffering for 10 years. And the trials and tribulations, it's surprising that doesn't have more. I mean, it's really based off one source, so I guess there's not a whole lot you could do. But anyway, that would make sense to me.
Can you talk a little bit about the religious aspect of exploration and settlement in Florida? Because I think, not to diminish the importance of the treasure fleets, but the missions that were established in Florida came along, I don't know if it was contemporary with some of these settlements you're talking about or afterwards, but it definitely put Spaniards and missionaries in the state pretty early on.
This right here, I think, not sure, is on his way to being canonized as one of the Florida martyrs, Luis Cancer. He is clubbed to death on the beach right here after he hops in the water. He is an attempt to evangelize without using any military force whatsoever, because he would argue that early attempts to evangelize used too many heavy-handed, abusive, exploitative tactics. We know that all of these fortified locations along the coast were also missions. We know that, and again, I'm leaning on the best of this is the stuff that John Wirt does. But you have a sprawling mission system that goes from St. Augustine across, and while most of them are in North Florida, they extend all the way down to the Juara and the Mayaca, the Ocala, the Petone. They're all over the place around Gainesville. And in fact, to add a wrinkle to how I answered your question earlier, by about 1595 to about 1605 to about 1620, you have Franciscans making inroads into the Panhandle from the Timucua to the Appalachee, and they would say that they are wildly successful in missionizing a large, urban, dense population, which is what they were struggling to do for 50 years at that point. And that actually is obviously devastating for the native population. This is where disease comes from. You have multiple rebellions. You have a slave trade, destroys all of these places. But there is a moment in about the 1680s, I believe, before it all begins to fall apart, where once again the Crown will attempt to shut down St. Augustine and La Florida and pull its funding. And who saves it are the missionaries, who say there are 50,000 native souls living under the mission bell, as we'd say by this point. And that is worth it. And so there are several levels of a religious dynamic to this. Before the missionaries, you had an absolute fight to the death between Pedro Menendez de Aviles, who was working on the orders of, the Pope and Philip II to destroy French Huguenots, who are Calvinists and Lutherans, and he absolutely massacres them on the east coast of Florida right here, which is why it's called Matanza, which is the massacre. And at every single, that is a whole aspect of this book. I tried to weave the Gulf into this, and there aren't a whole lot of missionary stories here. These are all, these only last a couple years because they are isolated and just as heavy-handed, and most of the Spanish soldiers there are killed. But most of the missionizing is here. But that is only one chapter in a very long history of the Catholic presence. And that's actually one of the foundational threads of the book, is that when you think of America's founding ideology, you immediately jump to the Protestant faith. And if you shift the lens down here, it is the Catholic faith. And it predates the Protestant faith by almost 100 years, right? Because Juan Pons, Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón, we don't even really know the first church services because we would know that one of the first things anyone would do when they would land was to have a mass. And so do you even really know when the first one would be, right? We know that the first permanent Catholic church would be in St. Augustine. But Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón built one. It, didn't last. Tristan de Luna would have. Hernando de Soto went to great lengths to carry bread and wine with him. So we know that I'm making an argument here for shipwrecks, but that would probably take backseat to the power of the Catholic faith, absolutely. And it is in every chapter of this story. We actually know that when Juan Ponce gets the capitulacion, right, he basically has in his hand, a copy of the requirement that he probably theoretically would have read to natives, which basically says, here's the Cliff Notes version of the Bible. You will become good Catholics or we will destroy you. And it is a legal mechanism for subjugating natives because there actually is a philosophical difference between a barbarian who has not learned the faith and an infidel who has learned the faith and has rejected the faith. And if you give someone a chance to learn the faith and they reject it, then you can destroy them. And we know that that's read here. Natives have absolutely, you think of the insanity of something like that. It's being read in Latin. These people have never, it's not the point. People don't have to understand it. All they have to do is reject it. That's the earliest Catholic. That's the earliest Catholic thread. Any other questions? All right. Well, I think please come see me afterwards.
If you would like to buy a book, the bookstore is still open, and Kevin will sign books in the back.